force to restore their idea of order. Studies of civil disturbances in the 1960s and 70s showed that aggressive law enforcement tactics were often the determining factor in instigating, escalating, and spreading violence. When law enforcement officials become confrontational at protests, it starts a cycle of escalating violence. So if the goal is to make the protests less violence, scapegoating ill-defined and amorphous enemies, whether we call them outside agitators, Antifa, violent anarchists, isn't the solution. Policymakers should instead embrace objective research regarding protest policing tactics and reject the escalating violence model that many law enforcement agencies are currently employing. Over 800 incidents of police violence against protesters captured on video since the police killing of George Floyd show police using tear gas, pepper spray, batons, and less lethal munitions indiscriminately, often targeting nonviolent protesters as well as journalists, legal observers, bystanders, and elected officials. More than 60 have suffered serious head injuries from law enforcement's improper use of so-called less lethal munitions, including fractured skulls, brain damage, and loss of vision. The vast majority of the millions of people that have participated in the Black Lives Matter protests have not engaged in acts posing a threat of death or serious bodily injury. People of varying ideologies have attended these protests, including those supporting Black Lives Matter and those opposing it. Armed white supremacists and far-right militants have made dozens of appearances, some claiming to support law enforcement and others to defend protesters from police. There are also people with no political agenda, mostly peaceful, but some not, who come to the protest. A relatively small number have engaged in serious violence, and it is important that law enforcement identify these assailants and address their crimes. But attributing violent acts to a particular group or movement without evidence is dangerous, as it misleads law enforcement about actual threats and spreads unwarranted fear. Disinformation about Antifa spread by white supremacist trolls has diverted law enforcement resources and encouraged armed vigilante groups to patrol streets in search of phantom enemies. Media analyses of protest arrests do not support the allegation that anti-fascists or violent anarchists are playing a significant role in the protest violence. The Trump administration has amplified this misinformation, however, blaming Antifa and threatening to designate it as a domestic terrorist organization. Antifa is not an organization, however, and there are no reported U.S. homicides resulting from anti-fascist actions for at least the last 25 years, so it would not be an appropriate target for such a designation. Misinformation in law enforcement intelligence doesn't just divert investigative resources, it potentially blinds them to real threats. 2 police officers have been killed and several injured by far-right Boogaloo adherents trying to trigger a civil war. 3 protesters have been killed in vehicle attacks. Law enforcement should focus on protecting against these deadly threats, not civil disobedience. The good news is that we already have an effective blueprint for reducing violence at protests. Policies requiring police to abandon the escalating force model and use force only when necessary to stop people from engaging activities that imminently threaten serious bodily harm have worked in the past to reduce violence.
I have a question for Mr. German. The Oregon Governor Kate Brown, the Attorney General Ellen Rosenblum, and other local officials have demanded that federal agents leave Portland, arguing that they have escalated violence in the city. Oregon Governor Kate Brown has stated, quote, "The federal officers here in the city brought violence and they brought strife to our community," end quote. Mr. German, you've talked about how aggressive riot control tactics against protesters incite greater violence in response. Would you say the tactics federal agents have used in Portland are ones that de-escalate protests or provoke violence?
Thank you for the question. Yeah, yes, it's obvious that those sorts of aggressive tactics increase protest violence, and this is something that has been studied for decades. So it's well known that even arriving in riot control clothing can instigate action within a crowd. So it's very important to look at the research and develop our tactics for reducing police violence based on objective research and not adopt tactics that were discredited decades ago.
You heard, I don't know if you heard Mr. Cuccinelli testify that all of the agents or the people from DHS, for example, get adequate training regarding crowd control and de-escalating the situation. Is that what you saw going on in Portland?
That's not what I saw. And to be clear, I'm not in Portland, but there are ubiquitous videos out there.
Yes.
And I follow a lot of local reporters. And what we saw are these escalating force tactics that was the model that was used in the 1960s that was discredited after a number of presidential commissions looked at this issue and tried to find ways to reduce protest violence.
And I think that
I think it's very dangerous to politicize law enforcement. Law enforcement has a very important job to protect the communities that they serve, and they need to be protected when they're engaged in that work. Unfortunately, when we politicize intelligence, which is what we've seen here, where many intelligence reports that have been released through Blue Leaks indicate a sensationalized vision of what Antifa is and the threat that it poses, that has distracted law enforcement from more serious threats that result in deadly violence.